This is Brad Tolinski, and we are watching the Break It Down show.
Yeah, and we're excited to talk with Brad today, who's, should we call them memoirs? Go ahead, Pete.
No, I think that's great. No, I'm just messing with the camera. Go on, John. Do what you do.
Okay. Well, so Brad has written an account of several conversations with the late and great Eddie Van Halen, whose 1 year anniversary of his passing is today. So, we celebrate him always, and especially thinking about him today. But we're really excited to talk with you, Brad, because you knew him in a way and over a period of time that is fascinating. So tell us how it all came to be.
Well, I was the editor-in-chief of Guitar World magazine, which I think it still is, but while I was the editor, I was for 25 years, the world's best-selling magazine for musicians. And, we would regularly feature Ed, and he trusted our magazine. He trusted us to understand where he was coming from as a person and a musician. So, I talked to Ed more than several times. I mean, I talked to him regularly over a good 30-year period. So when the book is entitled Eruption: Conversations with Eddie Van Halen, there are a lot of conversations. I mean, between me and my co-author, we easily, I mean, we say 50 hours, but it was probably more. I mean, I would spend a few days at a time with Ed and at his studio.
Wow. So over that course of time, I mean, Guitar World, really emerged around the same time as, I guess, the publishing of Guitar World began. Right around, would you say Van Halen 2 or maybe Fair Warning?
Well, no,
so
yeah, right. Right. Guitar World, I think I wasn't the founder of Guitar World. I think Guitar World started in 1980. So yeah, it was probably right around the time of the second record or third record. So yeah,
I mean,
we
as
sort
a
of grew on
publication,
parallel paths. And it was funny because whenever Ed had something to say, he would always reach out to us, and maybe it was an album, but maybe it was a new guitar, or just he wanted to chat. One of the last requests that he had was for us to do a joint interview with him with Les Paul, which never
wow.
happened for various reasons. But we had that kind of relationship. There was the regular joke was that, oh, you guys probably have a red telephone on your desk with black and white stripes, a hotline directly to 5150
Yeah.
Studios. It wasn't quite like that, but we were friendly.
Yeah, you are definitely a safe place. I mean, Guitar World in your custody was and still is the preeminent guitar magazine for guitar purists. And as much of a rock star, and as much as he defined rock stardom, he was at his core a guitarist in the purest sense.
Well, that was just it. I mean, Ed looked at the world through the lens of his guitar, if you will. So that's one of the ways that both me and my co-author Chris Gill created a rapport with him. He knew he could talk to us about the guitar and that we would understand what he was talking about, and it was through that we would connect on almost anything you could imagine, from his personal relationships to his home life, to his relationship with his son. Uh, and Ed, once you were brought in and once you were trusted, was pretty honest guy. Um, there were some moments where he would fudge the truth a little bit, as we all do, I suppose. But it wasn't often.
What are longtime and deep fans of Ed going to learn in the book, or what kind of connection is going to be different about the book than we've made in years of reading magazine articles and stuff? What would you say is the angle that the book took that we haven't seen yet?
Well, that's a great question. And when I started the book, I was thinking about what can I bring to it. And in the very beginning, I didn't exactly know. It was interesting. So, many of the times when I spoke to Ed, it was sort of within the context of, of that bubble, So writing the book gave me a chance to really step back and reflect on everything that we would talk about, that we had talked about. And I think really what got me excited about it, and what I think that the book presents, is actually the most clear and detailed portrait of the man as a whole, not just the guy that recorded Running with the Devil, or this song, or this particular period of life. We tried to make sense of his entire life. And he was a pretty complex guy. I mean, people have this image of him as the smiling sort of all-American kid, but he was really he was an immigrant from Holland. He came here when he was 7, 8 years old. Didn't speak any English.
Spoke only Dutch.
Spoke only Dutch. Experienced a lot of difficulties fitting in. He got bullied in school, and so what he did was he ended up retreating, and where he retreated, it was into this world of music. Initially, he was studied classical piano, and he was quite gifted at that. And then that turned into, as the times changed and he got older, and he got seduced by rock and roll like the rest of us, he changed over to the guitar. And it was sort of this twist, and this tug of war between wanting to express himself musically, and having this sort of social anxiety and dealing with the public that drove the best of them and the worst of them. And I wanted to kind of show through the book how these early formative experiences created the genius that we all know and love.
Mm-hmm.
I was going to
I
ask
think
about,
I think it's the most fulsome portrait you're going to get of Ed. There's been Sammy's book, and there's been Valerie Bertinelli's book, and there have been some other books out there, and everybody seems to have their agenda, and they also focus on this one little period of time. Well, we tried to sort of step way back and say, what does all of this mean? And
when you look
just,
at your
I
conversations
guess,
with
just to
other
add one
guitarists,
more thing to it, is that we had our ideas of it, but the important thing in the book is it always goes back to Ed's voice and his response.
I think my microphone's okay. I got it working right now. I wanted to ask about, you've had conversations with a bazillion artists, right?
Yeah.
What made Ed stand out along the way? And we're talking decades of relationships. These guys be professionals at talking with media. What made him different?
Well, it's funny. I was sitting there. I knew I had to post something on Facebook today, and I didn't want to just go out there and say, "Oh, buy my book" or something like that. I wanted to say something from the heart about Ed, or, what I thought about him. And so that was difficult. But I think if I had to sort of narrow it down, you'd almost say that Ed was like the combination of Robert Johnson and Thomas Edison sort of rolled into one. He was this brilliant, innovative guitarist, and plus an inventor, right? And he completely rethought this thing called the electric guitar, which is culturally the most important instrument of the last 100 years. And so that automatically makes him sort of a fascinating figure, right? I mean, not only is he great as a player and he reinvents the instrument through his playing technique, but he also literally reinvents it, by coming up with all sorts of new ideas that he applies not only to the guitar, but to his amplification. So it isn't just translated into this music that we love, but literally, if you're a guitarist, you are going to be, whether you like him or not, or admired him or not, you are affected by his inventions. I mean, people say, well, he's the entire package. I guess that's part of it. He's the entire package. But, in terms of the relationship, he was also a person that was looking for a deeper connection with people that he trusted. So Guitar World was one of these places where he could go, and again, he could explain himself and know that we would understand. So, I think on that level, it was personally affecting too. So, there was this professional relationship, there was this almost intellectual relationship, and then because of who he was, there was a personal relationship as well.
I imagine length of time and the fact that you provided him such a safe place to land and express himself lent to the personal relationship as well, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I mean, he was a funny guy when you got past that barrier, and he brought you into his world. He really, he wanted to build an emotional sort of, connection, a friendship connection. And he had this thing where, like when you were part of what he called the 5150, the 5150 group, when he greeted you, he didn't like just give you a hug. He kissed you full square on the lips. So it's one time he would go and he would he would sort of go in and you'd like offer, like you'd say, oh, well, it must be a European thing. But no, he would grab you by the face and plant one right on the lips. And that was his expression of saying, look, dude, you are important to me. You're a special person. And, it's like almost being in the mob or something like that. You were in Eddie's mob.
You'd have to be pretty darn special. We've had Rick Marotta on the show a few times, and you mentioned his connection with Les Paul, and I would even argue that our generation sort of had Eddie as our Les Paul. He was the innovator. He was the guy who wasn't afraid to pull things apart and put them back together in ways that made it useful to him. But a number of years ago, the world celebrated Les Paul's 75th birthday, and Rick Marotta was the musical director of that celebration, and all of the guitarists came out. And he said out of all of them, to be the musical director and have to herd all of those cats, from B.B. King to Eric Clapton to Steve Miller to everybody else, the one who drove him absolutely bananas was Eddie. And he said it in such a loving way because Eddie would call him in the middle of the night and fret over Hot for Teacher. And, he just tried to reassure him and all of that. But when it came down to it, it meant so much to him that he delivered for everybody and for Les the absolute best performance he could with Hot for Teacher. Is that as a not just his friend and not just as a journalist, but as a guitar player, what does that level of expectation and his standard mean to you and mean to the instrument?
It's interesting that you bring up Les Paul because, and you'll see in the book we talk about their relationship, but Les Paul was sort of Ed's spiritual godfather, if so to speak. He was his role model, and it was funny. Like people would ask him who his influences were, and Ed listened to a lot of music, but he didn't have a lot of people that had a direct influence on him. And one was Eric Clapton, and another one was a progressive rock guitarist named Alan Holdsworth had a big impact on him.
Yeah.
But Tony Iommi's another. But really, if you asked Ed who was the person that really, who he really admired or who he related to, it was Les Paul. Because Les was an incredibly, it's sort of forgotten in time a little bit now, but he was incredibly innovative player, but he was also a guitar inventor. And I even did like so Ed and Les had this connection. And if you knew Les at all, and I didn't know Les well, but I chatted with him a few times. He had a super earthy sense of humor, so Ed, even though Les was 20, 30 years older than Ed, they could totally bro down with the best of them. And Les would call Ed, being completely oblivious of the time changes from New York to California. And like Ed said, I'd get these phone calls at like 3 o'clock in the morning and it would be Les on the other line saying, "Hey, Ed," and Ed said, well, I'd always take the call because it was Les Paul. And Les always signed off with the same thing saying, to Ed, it's me, you, and Leo, meaning Leo Fender.
Wow.
So in Les's mind, Van Halen was
Picked
in
that
that holy trinity, if you will. And I did like I didn't go too deep on it because I wanted a general public to be able to embrace the book and have, I didn't want it to completely be going over everybody's head with too much guitar detail, although it's an important part of it. But I did this little almost sidebar chapter on what I find to be an incredible, I don't know, coincidence. I don't know exactly what you would call it. But it's interesting to me that that Les Paul, Leo Fender, Eddie Van Halen, Bigsby, who invented the tremolo arm for the guitar, these and George Beecham, okay, who invented the electric guitar, all lived within a 20-mile radius of each other in Southern California. I mean, think about that. That's a little crazy. That's a little crazy. Yeah. And they're all from different generations and different periods, but they're all within this 20-mile radius. I had to sit there and figure out, like, I was like, oh, he was here, he was there, he was there. And I took out my Google Maps and I was like, holy cow, this is sort of cool. It's like if Mickey Mantle and Joe DiMaggio and Babe Ruth all lived within, like, a block of each other or something like that. It's crazy.
Yeah. Well, for the rest of the country, to give it context, LA is the biggest metropolitan area by landmass. So 20 minutes away from each other, all in that space. 20 minutes in Creston, Iowa is a long way, but in Los Angeles, that's practically the same neighborhood.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's sort of this incredible sort of spiritual connection between these great guitar inventors. They all sort of, were in this little area.
I happened to witness an impromptu jam at a NAMM show many, many years ago. And before I realized that Eddie Van Halen and Alan Holdsworth even knew each other, I just got to see them both with guitars in their hands for about 5 minutes, and they melted everyone's face, just horsing around. And that
Yeah.
really, at that time, I mean, I was probably about 19 years old at the time, and Eddie Van Halen, of course, was, I mean, he was it to me. I knew of Alan Holdsworth, but just to find out that the two of them knew and had a friendship with each other, and then influenced each other musically, was mind blowing to me. And how much of his relationship with Alan and other guitarists who most probably rock players wouldn't imagine he was connected to. Did you mention in the book?
Well, I think people see the connection between some of the people that we talk about in the book, but what might be surprising to the reader is how welcoming Ed was. I mean, to some degree, his studio, which was essentially in his backyard, the 5150 studio, became a little bit of a salon for guitar players. He would have, Alan would come and stay at his house, and Steve Vai would be over, and Ed would bring in some of these guys that we know, sort of the who's of shredders from the 80s that sort of looked up to him, would have him come over to the house. But some of the conversations in our book are with other guitar players. And we had one with Ed and Tony Iommi that we conducted together. Now, when Van Halen's first major tour was with Black Sabbath.
Yeah.
So they had a friendship there. But, also beyond that, before Van Halen was named Van Halen, they were named Rat Salad, which was a Black Sabbath song, which shows you how much Ed loved Black Sabbath. So we interviewed Tony and talked about their lifelong relationship. And we also had a great conversation with Steve Vai. Now, people would say, oh, yeah, well, that makes sense. Steve Vai, one of the great instrumentalist virtuosos. But people sort of forget that Steve has a special insight into Eddie's playing and who he was, because he replaced Ed in David Lee Roth's first solo band.
Yeah.
And Steve, half of their set was Van Halen songs. Steve had to learn all of Eddie's tunes and all of his licks to play, in David Lee Roth's band. So, it was important for me to talk to him just to capture what that period was like. And for him as a player, what he had to learn and what he had, from playing Ed, and his insights into Ed's playing, Ed's special sort of relationship with Ed.
How was their personal relationship, the two of them?
It was good. I mean, Ed would have Steve over to his studio, and I tell this great story in the book about how Steve introduced Ed's music to Frank Zappa, who Frank loved it, and they had Ed over to Zappa's studio. And so Ed went over to Frank's studio that he had in his home, and sat around with Frank and Steve and Ed, and of course 3 great guitar players. They start jamming, and they're playing, and there's some fret buzz. There's like one of the strings is rubbing up against one of the frets and making sort of a buzzing sound, right? So Steve goes, well, let's get another guitar. And Ed was like, looked around the room and said, no, we don't need another guitar. This is fine. And he grabs a screwdriver off of Frank's table or mixing console and jams it under the nut of the guitar to lift the string up, and then just starts playing again. And they're passing around this guitar with the screwdriver sticking. But Steve used that as a way to explain Ed's whole approach to making music, in that he would do whatever it takes to create the sound that he was hearing in his head. If it meant shoving a screwdriver, under the nut of his guitar, then that's what he would do. And Steve was saying, and he wouldn't mess around. He'd figure it out then, right then, there, and now. So they had a fine relationship, and Ed's position on the whole thing was like, hey man, if you're a guitar player and you're doing your own thing, then I'm interested. And I think that's
great.
the way he saw Steve and Frank Zappa.
I'm really happy to hear that. The other offshoot that came from what you were just talking about was Ed's relationship with Dweezil Zappa. And for the non-guitar players out there, Frank Zappa was, he was kooky for a lot of people, and he was a showman for sure. But he always assembled the top-notch band that could be assembled at the time. And he was himself a monster instrumentalist on the guitar. And then he raised Dweezil, who's a monster still. And Eddie had a lot to do with Dweezil's development, and just the fact that I think, when you grow up with a Frank Zappa, maybe everybody's dad isn't cool, and you don't realize how cool your dad is when you're at a certain age. But the fact that his dad was hanging around with Eddie Van Halen, I think, changed everything. Did you talk to Dweezil about Ed at all?
I didn't because, I know Dweezil, and I've talked to him in the past, but to me, and in the context of the book, I had that Steve Vai, Frank Zappa connection. And to me, that was more sort of intrinsic to the
specific
story.
to what you were doing.
Yeah. But, I think what Dweezil has done is fantastic. And the way he has honored his father's memory, Frank's memory, by carrying on and playing music, is probably a little not unlike sort of what Wolfgang is doing now for his dad. You know what I mean? So there are these, there is an interesting connection there. And also I have to say, when Ed went to Frank's studio for the story that I'm telling you, that's sort of what inspired Ed to build his own studio. So there's all this there's an interesting Zappa connection. You don't really hear it so much in the music. Their approach to music was very different, but I think sort of philosophically and intellectually, Ed and Frank had this great connection, as well as Dweezil and Steve Vai, who also played in Frank Zappa's band. There was a real connection there.
I just want to jump in here real quick and let everybody know we're talking to Brad Tolinski, who wrote a book called ERUPTION. He co-authored it with another guy named Chris Gill. And what it is it's a conversation with Eddie Van Halen. It's Chris, it's Brad, and other people they bring in, and basically do a biographical anthology of these stories to kind of give us an insight as to who Eddie was and the kind of person that he was as a guitar player. That link is on the show. You can also look in the show notes, and you can get the book on Amazon. So just go ahead and go do that. Now I'm going to be quiet and let John do his job.
Well, I do want to address just one really quickly what you're saying about how the book is organized. And it was this, I had a previous book that I wrote called Light and Shade: Conversations with Jimmy Page, another great guitar player. And I found this, I sort of discovered this format that I just loved, and I continued it on this book, which is essentially telling the biographical details of the story, giving my own spin on the events. And then it's followed with the actual artist's recollection of that time. So so you get this little, you get the story, you understand all the context, and then you get this little bit of tug of war between my observations, but the artist gets the last word and you make up your mind from there, So I think this is a relatively new format, for a book. I've never seen anybody else do it, but I did that with Jimmy Page. We did this with Eddie Van Halen. And I think the most important thing is you're never going to get an autobiography from Eddie Van Halen because, he's gone. But this is the closest you're going to get because you hear a lot of his own opinions, his own views.
Yeah. Thank you for your, your respectful capture of that, because the world missed out that we'll never get an autobiography. And he wasn't wired to create an autobiography. And so it's just that it comes from the standpoint of somebody who understood his viewpoint as an instrumentalist and, what the guitar meant to him, how important that was, not just a personality book. So thanks for that.
Yeah. I looked at a recent quote unquote Ed Van Halen biography that came out very recently. And they didn't even mention in the biography his Frankenstein guitar, which is inconceivable to me. It's like doing a book on Picasso and not mentioning he's a painter. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But so this book, I was telling you earlier, I had to do a post on Facebook, and I did a quick sketch of what Ed sort of meant to me, but also why I did the book. And some of it was because I don't think the entertainment media quite understands the significance of Edward. Because like I said, he wasn't just a rock star. He was a guy that literally changed the face of the electric guitar. And to me, you don't have to be a guitarist or a scholar to understand that, but it's important that people do understand his contributions in the larger picture.
Well, one of the things that made him a cultural icon was the fact that, a bunch of teenage boys who were trying to figure out their own identities could latch onto this guy who was not only the biggest rock star in the world, but he was also the everyman and the underdog. And that guitar was such a big part of it because he made it okay to not have the $1,500 guitar, to have the instrument that you took apart and put together for your own sound. And all of those things were what made his contribution so important, not just his virtuosity, just the fact that we all connected to him in so many different ways because he was, the underdog, the immigrant, the everyman, like he was. And I don't even have a question. Just please expand on that point, having known him better than most anybody.
Well, I'll even take it further because you bring up something that is just an interesting, broader observation about our world and our culture. So when I became the editor of Guitar World, the idea in my head was that Guitar World was going to be a love letter to my 14-year-old self who wanted to learn how to play the guitar, right? I mean, I was far away from being 14 at the time that I did it. I mean, I was in my late 20s. But I thought to myself, I don't really want to talk to adult musicians, to be honest with you. I don't want to, because adults already have their mind made up. They're going to do what they want to do. They'll get something out of the magazine. We'll have plenty of techniques, things. But what I really wanted to do was sort of inspire younger musicians. And at that time, and this might sound a little sexist now, but I'm saying there were such few things to inspire young guys to be creative. It probably still is now. Like at that time, there were plenty of things to encourage people to play sports or do other things, but very few things aimed at young guys to say, hey, it's okay to be a creative person. It's okay to be an artist. It's okay to express yourself,
Wow.
So Guitar World in many ways was me saying, I'm going to dig into like young rock and roll guitar players, because I know that's going to inspire kids. And whatever way they take it, it's great, but I'm going to give them something that's well edited, something inspiring, something that they're going to have fun with, and something that will make them, try to reach into that inner artist, right? That inner and express themselves. And I don't, like I said, I still think to this day there isn't all that much aimed at young guys to be able to express that part of themselves. So when you talk about that, it really makes me happy, because that's exactly what we were trying to do, and Ed Van Halen was this very relatable figure.
Yeah,
He
that
just
that
seemed
seems to
like
be
he
why
was,
you guys got each other.
yeah, he just seemed like he was having fun. He was creating stuff. And I'll tell you, uh, his smile was famous, right? Everybody knows the famous Ed Van Halen grin. What's really cool about that is that smile was genuine. That's something that came every time he picked up the guitar.
Yeah.
Like he was a man at home when he had his guitar. Like there might be other shitty things going on in his life, and he had plenty of things that he was contending with, in different parts of his life. He had issues with substance abuse, and he had, marital issues, or, he was battling cancer over the last 20, 30 years of his life. But he put that guitar on and he went to his happy place, and he was having a good time, and he was fun. And you as anybody as a viewer or a listener could hear it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I want to
Could
ask
hear it,
you,
could see it.
Yeah.
the 14-year-old version of you, if you told him, hey, you're not only going to know Eddie Van Halen, you're going to be kiss on the lips close with him, right? And I don't mean to be like queer or anything. I'm just saying, like, to blow a 14-year-old's mind like that.
Yeah.
Be like, this is how close you're gonna be in the inner circle. What would
Yeah.
that Brad said?
I mean, look, that's been a gift to me in my entire life, is that kind of conversation and personal bond I can have with these incredible musicians, and I've talked to almost all the greatest guitar players. I mean, I have a picture of me standing in between Jimmy Page and Jeff Beck. I mean, so that, Ed, when I was 13, there was no Ed Van Halen. There was sort of no nothing out there. Like, in order for you to learn how to play the guitar, you had to put the needle on a record and slow it down to half speed so you could sort of figure out the notes. There were no transcriptions. There were no, I mean, it was like, I can remember being mystified when I was a kid, like trying to figure out like a Led Zeppelin song, and I'd hear the rhythm guitar and the lead guitar going on at the same time. I didn't know. I was just some kid out in Michigan. Like, I didn't know that there was such thing as overdubs. I thought Jimmy Page was playing rhythm and lead both at the same time, like, and how does he do that? Oh no, all this. So Guitar World, again, what its heyday before the internet, was teaching all these people and giving them the tools that they needed, to express themselves and to overcome the enormous hurdles that I had to learn how to play guitar.
I wanted to, so I was talking with Chris Thomas King recently. I had him on the show. He's become a bit of a friend now.
Yeah.
And he's like, would you ever think, Chris Thomas, for those who don't know, Chris Thomas King can play the fuck out of the guitar.
Yeah.
And he's like, would you ever believe we live in a world when a lead guitar wasn't leading popular music? It's just not a thing anymore. And he asked me what I thought about that. And the only thing I could come up with, and this is not in any way a knock on Gary Clark Jr., but I saw Gary Clark Jr. play, and it's all, for now, it's all been done. And it was I don't want to say the word boring, but I had seen it enough before that that's not the cutting edge of music anymore. And I wonder
No.
what you would say, and what do you think Ed would say to that? And it's not that he was done creating, but it's not leading popular music. It's something else.
No, and Ed knew that. Um, and Ed knew that the audience had shifted and all that stuff. And that leads to another long story, which we can get into before the end of this, because it's sort of an interesting one. Yeah, music has shifted. I besides playing guitar, I also play violin and mandolin, and I play other instruments. And to be honest with you, I'm a consumer. I like new things. I like hearing new ideas. I'm not a guy that says, "Oh, we should all just be listening to Van Halen forever and ever." My son, who's in his 20s, is a great drummer, but he's also into electronic music, and he creates it himself, and it's terrific. And yeah, man. Uh, I used to do, I guess one of my things was, and I meant this tongue in cheek. I was sort of like, every generation is entitled to their own garbage music. like, like, I loved Alice Cooper. I'm not going to apologize for that. Is Alice Cooper, profound? Is Alice Cooper this? Is Alice? No, but I had a great time. I love those records, And do I expect my son to be listening to Alice Cooper? No, I don't, man. Music changes, it evolves, it grows. That's the beautiful thing about it. But as a music historian, I think it's important to learn, look back and learn and see how the music changes and evolves. And I do feel like, um, the guitar is continually developing, um, and doing new things, and you just never know. All it takes is one genius,
Yeah.
to change everything. Uh, you know, Nobody saw Kurt Cobain coming, and when Nirvana happened, it changed everything around. Nobody saw Eddie Van Halen happening. I mean, you have to go back to the first Van Halen record, and new wave was raging then. Everybody thought synthesizers were going to take over the world, and all of a sudden you have a young genius like Eddie Van Halen, who figures out something interesting and new to do with the guitar, and music changes and follows. The tools change. That's okay. Hey, I still listen to my Charlie Christian, Benny Goodman records. I mean, I'll listen to a clarinet, but I don't expect the clarinet to have maintained, its supremacy. But I could gab your ear off on why the clarinet was so big during the 40s, and it had to do with music technology. I'll take one quick diversion, and then we'll get back to Eddie Van Halen. So, during in the 40s, right, the technology, the phonograph, and the frequencies it could convey, the favored the clarinet. So the frequency range wasn't that big in the early stereos and early phonographs, but boy, did that technology love the sound of a clarinet. So you get the technology happening, and all of a sudden that's the instrument, So the technology improves, and all of a sudden you have this instrument, the electric guitar, which has a broader frequency range, right? It's got these low strings, it's got these high strings. The stereo loves the electric guitar, and so you have British invasion music, and you have it coming through the radio, and people go, "Oh my God, I love that." So technology affects everything. Now the technology is favoring digital instruments and synthesizers and samplers, and it just, it just favors it. because you can get those low bass frequencies and these piercing high sounds. So technology plays a role as well. And it's also part of the story of this book is Ed changed the way amps were made. He changed the way guitars were made, and that changed the way music was made. It's all sorts of things going on here.
He changed our expectation for the sonic capabilities that were required to produce a live show. I mean, there were so many things that made him not just the custodian of the guitar. He was sort of the custodian of the arena rock movement for a while, and the demands that that he put on everything really expanded everybody's ears. Is there something in the book that speaks to what drove him in those directions, because his while we've been talking about his greatness on the guitar and his desire to express the world and see the world through that instrument, it was more than that. I mean, he gave us more than just here I am on my guitar. He gave us all the cultural things, all of the things that made him, like you said, relatable. And really his redefinition of rock stardom was a more approachable one than somebody like Tony Iommi.
Well, I mean, it was also sort of it was balanced out by the fact that he had David Lee Roth in the band, who was more than willing to shoulder that burden of being a rock star.
Also true.
In fact, Ed's common sort of critique, but later on it became more admiration, was that Dave was a rock star and he was a musician. But I think he appreciated the fact that he had the rock star in his band allowed him to be the musician, So, I don't think it was always apparent to him that, because they drove each other absolutely bonkers. But later on in life, Ed had a lot of epiphanies as he grappled with his mortality due to his fight with cancer, that made him look back and really appreciate everybody that had helped him along the way in a way that he just hadn't been able to when he was younger.
Not the first time we've heard that on this show from a very, very well-known musician, right, John?
Yeah. Well, you know what? How about this? When Ed started out and he was doing, like you said, his technique was new and ridiculous. And, famously, when he started off, he didn't want people to see it. So a lot of times he'd turn his back when he was doing something interesting. And then in the end of his career, I saw within the last few years, I saw him play the tour that he did with Dave back in the band, where his solo, was substantial in the middle, and there was a camera pointed right at his hands. Like, go ahead, take it, I dare you.
Yeah.
And can you speak to the evolution of his thinking there?
Sure, absolutely. There is a bit in the book where we talk about at one point very early on in his career, where he started making all these, innovations on his instrument, whether it be the stripes or the locking system or one pickup, in the back. For you who out there in this audience, I don't mean to sound like I'm talking gibberish, but I think people do have some sense that Ed's guitar was a unique instrument, visually, but it was also unique technologically in a bunch of substantial ways that if you were a guitar player, you would sort of get immediately. And he made those changes himself. He created those things in his garage. So all of a sudden, all these things are being celebrated, and he becomes this big rock star. And we have this one scene in the book where he is around the time of like the third record of Women and Children First, he goes into a music store. And the reason he created this guitar in the first place was because the music store wasn't giving him what he wanted. So he had to build what he wanted. And all of a sudden he goes into the music store and he looks up and there's all these guitars that look like his guitar that he built. And he realizes everybody's ripping me off blind and I'm not getting a cent for any of this. He has this realization. And, some people might think that it was selfish that early on he would turn his back, or maybe he would tell less than the truth about what was on his guitar and what he was doing. But some of that was just self-preservation, so somebody else wouldn't take his ideas and steal them and take all the fame and the glory and the money and the whatever else that comes along with it. That shocked him. But then once he got over the shock of that, he decided, well, people are going to figure this stuff out anyways. I might as well drive the narrative for this. And that's when he starts getting involved in all these different guitar companies. He goes to Kramer, he goes to Ernie Ball, he ends up building his own company. And it's sort of fascinating because most guitarists will have a signature guitar, right? But no other guitar player ended up with his own signature company. And that's where Ed's head was at, was like, okay, if I'm going to give this to you, I'm not only going to give it to you, but I'm going to give it to you right. And I'm going to give you all sorts of extra stuff you never even thought of or dreamed of. Now, at one point we were toying with this in the book and we didn't do this, but, maybe at some point we'll put it up online or whatever. But we had we had gotten our hands on this correspondence that Ed had with the people at Fender Guitars who were making his EVH guitars about his pickup, the thing that on the guitar that translates the sounds from the strings to the amplifiers, for those that don't know what a pickup is. And pickups are made in all sorts of different ways and different sounds and different styles, and they affect your tone. And Ed was obsessed with getting the pickup right to create the sound that he was hearing in his head. And we have literally 300 pages of him that span over a couple of years, just him going back and forth with Fender about the creation of this pickup. Like most people might have an hour conversation with somebody on how to build it. This is how granular and how obsessed Ed was with getting the sound perfect, with getting it right. He would just go back and forth, and you would see the correspondences. It'd be like Groundhog's Day. I'd like, do this, do that, do that. And then he'd get the pickup back and you'd see it from their side of like, so is this right? And I'd be like, nope. it would just go back and forth, and it was fascinating. You were asking me, well, what drove this, right? So I wrestled with that thought, and during conversation I had again with Steve Vai, that's in this book, Steve said, well, it all begins with hearing it in your head. It all begins like Ed, it wasn't an accident. Ed heard something in his head, heard a sound, because he's a musician and an artist that he had to make real. And it all begins with what you hear. And Ed was hearing something that nobody else had heard before. So he had to do everything he could to get that sound. And then as a musician, he evolved. So that sound would change. And so he was always pursuing it. And every once in a while, like the rest of your listeners out there, right? You're a fan. You want to know, gee, Ed, how did you get this tone on Van Halen 2? And Ed would go back there and talk a little bit about that. But it was always like, that was always like a little boring to him. And he had this phrase where he would say, look, there's a reason that God put eyes in front of your head, because you should be looking forward.
So you could look forward.
Yeah. He says you didn't put them on the back of your head, right? You put them in the front, and he was like, that stuff's cool. And what we could talk about that. But what really interests me is, that thing, that thing next year, that thing 10 years from now. And so, because he was an artist, and he was a great musician, that's what drove him, was literally people have a hard time just accepting that, like, if you're a really genuine artist, the art is the end goal, right? It's capturing it, it's making it sound right, it's getting it, this thing that you're in the head, getting it on tape somewhere, getting it on a digital console. And that's what drove him. It's as simple as that.
Wow.
Really.
Yeah. And that's why we never got an Eddie Van Halen signature guitar manufactured by someone else with just his signature on it, because that wasn't good enough. And
that wasn't good enough.
Yeah. If there's a lesson in Eddie Van Halen's legacy that encapsulates it all, to me, it would be, that wasn't good enough, and that he strove for the absolute best. How do you see it?
I think, I think you sort of nailed it. I think that there's one interesting side note, which is Ed would be the first to admit there's no right. There's no perfect sound. It's only the sound that he felt was perfect. And he would admit, he goes, look, this is a selfish pursuit. This is because I'm building this entire company and building these amps because I want it for myself. I want it. It's my pursuit, and if people can take these tools and do something with them, then God bless. And I think that they absolutely should, and they shouldn't imitate me. They shouldn't copy me, but he would admit it was a selfish pursuit to some degree.
Well, I'll tell you, I'll speak for the musicians out there, and I'll say that, Brad, we sure are glad that your pursuit was to capture the story of Eddie Van Halen in the purest way, in a way that would honor his life, and in a way that would be told that he wouldn't have told himself. So thank you for doing that. The book is called Eruption, everybody. You can get it on Amazon. There are links below, and you should. To celebrate the life of the late, great Eddie Van Halen, whose passing happened 1 year ago today. Our guest today has been Brad Tolinski. Brad, thanks, man. Thank you so much.
Well, thanks, John. Thanks, Pete. You've got a lovely show here, and thanks for having me on.
Hey, thanks for watching the show. I really appreciate it. Right here, you can subscribe. Please do that. It makes the show grow. Hit that notification bell so you know which incredible guest is coming up next. Down below is the PayPal link. You can put a small subscription in. That is an enormous help. All that money goes right back into the show. And then right up over here are the next episodes you should listen to, curated by yours truly. Thank you so much for watching the Break It Down Show.